Deep Space Nine is the Star Trek with the greatest focus on political concepts like colonialism, feminism, queerness, and post-scarcity economics. Join hosts and guests who aren't just Trekkies, but activists, academics, artists, therapists, and more as we take a deep dive into the text and subtext where few Star Trek podcasts have gone before.
Here on Deep Space Dive, we'll be discussing Deep Space Nine's themes and characters, not doing recaps. Also, because we're talking about the show in its entirety, this show will be full of spoilers. If you're watching Deep Space Nine for the first time, we recommend that you finish your binge and then go back and listen to the podcast from the beginning. It will be archived and waiting for you.
Indeed, hosted at Graphic Policy Radio, because I keep not making a Deep Space Dive spin-off RSS feed because I'm neurotic. Like, this is just a fact. Who am I? I'm Ilana Levin, also the host of Graphic Policy Radio. I've worked at the intersection of comics, nerd culture, and social change for over a decade. And my biggest Trek cred is I gave a speech on fan activism at a rally organized by Lita, aka Chase Masterson.
I'm Sarah Daniel Rasher. When I'm not getting paid to use math to save the world, I write about film and figure skating. I was the founding captain of my high school Star Trek club, and I once got Nicole DeBoer to kiss me at a convention.
I'm still jealous. And joining us today, I have a guest who I'm extraordinarily excited about our guest, but I'm extraordinarily excited about Rafael Shimunov. Raf, who I've known for a long time through activism and organizing world in New York. Raf is an artist and activist who arrived in the U.S. with his parents as a HIAS child refugee from the Soviet-dominated Uzbekistan. He is a Bukharian Jew, one of Central Asia's many minority ethnic groups, and who have largely settled in Queens. You've likely seen him go viral when Ellen DeGeneres' lawyers tried to censor his criticism of her support of disgraced former President George Bush on Twitter. His installing an illegal exhibit in the Whitney Museum to protest this leader's manufacturing of chemical explosives sold to Trump's Border Patrol, or his 12 million viewer live stream during the JFK airport protests against the Trump Muslim ban. I was there. From the airport he and his family arrived in as refugees. So you guys have probably seen Raf's digital work online if you're involved in following social issues at all. And you might not know Ralph is a big Trekkie. Ralph spends his days taking on Amazon's racist surveillance and abuses of local democracies, workers, small businesses, and the climate with the Athena Coalition, a national grassroots movement made up of frontline communities taking on Amazon.
Today, we're talking about Worf. We first met him on The Next Generation when the sight of a Klingon on the bridge of the Enterprise signaled a new era of Star Trek stories. During his 7-year run on The Next Generation, Worf raised a child, got knocked down by lots of enemies and a few blue plastic barrels, hooked up with Deanna Troi, and became one of the franchise's most beloved characters.
Apparently, literally all the TNG I've seen was episodes I watched in preparation for this show, and I guess also a Q episode, so I'm taking your word for it, and it sounds about right. This
podcast is clearly my backdoor way of getting you to watch TNG.
Successful.
Yeah. Anyway,
not only
Worf,
popular, he's the most, I think I read, the most recurring character throughout all of the different series, right?
Yeah.
Amy and I actually counted it up, and he's tied with Riker.
Oh, well then. I guess that's because of the new Picard series where they didn't have Worf and they did have Riker.
Exactly. That's where, it's that and Riker is on lower decks.
Oh, wow.
That's how Riker
a lot of
catches
Riker.
up.
That's a whole lot of Riker.
It is really a whole lot of Riker.
Too much Riker.
Yeah. If you count Thomas Riker as the same character as William Riker, he actually beats him by one, but I do not. That is a separate person. When Worf arrived in Deep Space Nine's 4th season, that made him the only character to become a series regular on 2 90s Trek series. On Deep Space Nine, Worf stood out as a buttoned-up rule follower, but also became a beloved member of the crew and a point of entry into intricate Klingon political drama, as well as half of one of Star Trek's most epic on-screen romances.
Possibly the hottest one that was actually in canon?
Today, we'll talk about all things Worf, but especially about his depiction as a Jewish person of color, directly within the show's coding of his background, and metaphorically as an individual who finds meaning in his multiple identities.
So I knew I wanted my friend Ralph on the show from the moment he told me he was a DS9 fan, and I let him pick the topic because there were so many things I could imagine him choosing. But when he told me that he related so much to Worf as a fellow Jew of color growing up in a new culture, my jaw dropped. How did I not realize that Worf was Jewish? I mean, it's probably because I didn't watch TNG till I began prepping for this episode. But if I'd known that the great Israeli actor Theodore Beichel was Worf's father, if your dad plays Tevye in Israel and becomes president of an actors union, you might be a Jew. So, but apparently it runs deeper than just the symbolism of his dad. So I'm so excited to learn about the Judaism of Worf. Raf, how did you get into Star Trek in the first place?
My parents, my parents fled Uzbekistan. I was 2 years old. We were HIAS refugees, and basically they learned English when they came here through Star Trek. So it was also kind of juxtaposed with them seeing this whole new country, and system of things and commercialism and things that they were isolated from. Uzbekistan was occupied by the Soviet Union during communism. During communism, I always like to remind people, white supremacy masquerading and colonialism masquerading as communism. But generally speaking, Star Trek was one of their entries into American culture, into the language, and it was particularly magical because it blurred the lines between what was magical offline. When they would go to the store, and this is a trope, in Coming to America and other movies, and what's the one with Robin Williams as a Russian immigrant, where you go into a store and you're just in awe of all the options and flavors and availability of items and medicine and all sorts of things. And they didn't when they saw things in Star Trek, they were challenged to be well, is this the fictional part of Star Trek, or do they have this in America? Do they have, my mom became a nurse, and she expected she was made fun of by her colleagues for asking where the turbo lift was in the hospital when she started.
Oh,
and,
totally.
And expected, because you're constantly surprised every day you go outside with very new modern things compared to some technologies that were 20 years back, where they came from, even more in some cases. And you kind of expected certain things. And for example, the tricorder, was that real, or is that Star Trek? So it was a really, really important aspect of our life. And it was really the one where we spent shared time the most outside of the dinner table.
Wow. You're my second friend, at least, who said they learned English from Star Trek. So it's a real thing, for real. And I love that it can have that role for people. And so when you told me that you wanted to do Worf, you made a pitch around him that just really knocked my socks off. What was it that made you identify with his experience so much?
It's funny because initially when you mentioned it, I was thinking this kind of surface level thing, where I would pitch this surface level aspect where, oh wow, his parents adopted him. They were Russian, and they were, presenting as Jews. Both of the actors. A lot of people talk about the father, but the mom is also Russian Jewish descent. She's from London. She was a singer. Her name was changed to Georgia Brown, and she moved to Hollywood. She died preparing to do a tribute to another Jew of color, Sammy Davis Jr. She herself is also a Jewish icon that rarely is really brought up, but both of them exhibiting all of these kind of Jewish coding in their mannerisms and in their expectations and their language with Worf, really on the surface level to me was interesting enough. And then I started to really for this talk, just yesterday and even last week, just thinking about it more. And there's this whole other level that I'll get into, but the surface level part, it is really Bukharian Jews. We are, there's not that many of us. We are less than, I think we're 300 or 200 something thousand maybe, and around the world. and I'm sorry, 300, a little over 300,000. And most of us settled in either Israel or New York. There's one, the last remaining Jew in Afghanistan who's still there. I think he's Bukharian. But generally speaking, on the surface level of it, our culture was very much influenced by so many things, but also colonialism, and the Russian aspect of it was colonialist, but it was also, it's hard to tell, it's hard to pull them apart from our identity. Our identity is intertwined with scores of Central Asian cultures, Chinese culture and Korean culture and Mongolian culture, and then also very dominant Russian culture. And in that way, I sort of really connected to Worf because of that infusion into his life, and also him being transplanted from his community. When my parents came here, there really weren't any other Bukharians here. There was no ethnic enclave. Like right now, we have a town called Rego Park in Queens, which people endearingly refer to as Regostan because of us, and that's there now. But when we were out here, we were rather isolated, and I really felt a lot of kinship with Worf because of that. Yeah, initially.
Coming to this, my knowledge of Worf from DS9, I didn't realize that Worf was Russian until I found out he had a son. I mean, boy, does he have a son, and we'll talk about him. But then his son's name was Alexander, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. And that's when I Googled it, and I'm like, Worf is Russian. And it's interesting because if you're watching TNG and it's like the early 90s, Worf being Russian is hugely politically significant. But by the time it's DS9, it seems like the Cold War theme in that particular angle is not as interesting to the writers of the show, but I think it might still be interesting to the viewers. And a part of me wonders, though, if maybe some of the reason that some of the writers dropped it is because by that point, people are looking at Worf as Worf, an individual, rather than, because they know him and love him from TNG, rather than Worf as a series of identities that he was created to hold.
Yes. And you could see actively the choices on TNG when he was introduced that they made, they were clearly political SJW choices. They were there to poke at what was uncomfortable. I think for example, I feel like Schitt's Creek, for example, which is this amazing show. It's also very Jewish, but the way that they'll place pansexuality in and not make it about that, but just in passing in the background and this and that. There's
wait, Schitt's Creek isn't about pansexuality. That's not what the whole show is about.
Exactly.
No, you and I have clearly watched different shows, but that's fine.
Oh no, I'm not saying it. I'm saying the opposite. It's absolutely not about it. It's in the background, but the choice of putting it in the background was a political choice.
And I don't think it's Worf not in the background at all. But
oh, really?
That's fine.
I guess, yeah.
That's the
from
point
our
of why
perspectives.
Sarah's watching it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the reason I was told to watch it. It's probably not the reason I stuck around, but yeah, I would differ from you there. But this is not our Schitt's Creek podcast. So
yeah.
So, did his Russianness matter to you as one of the Russians on TV, or was it just simply him being an outsider, alien character who's nevertheless embraced?
The Russianness mattered, especially to me at that age, where in my older age, where the Russianness was very critical to my development because it was targeted, because it's attached to my name, right? So it's OV.
Right.
So I was just this confusing thing to people, why do you have a Spanish name? And then I explained it's a Hebrew name that Spanish, Latinos like. And then, and then in terms of the last name, that also got me in the middle of, a school in the projects where 20% of the kids were Afghan refugees who were scarred by another war, the Soviet war in Afghanistan. And when they saw the last name, that triggered them. That created a lot of problems that had to be resolved or not. And then, I had a grade school teacher, 6th grade. I moved to schools, and this teacher was beloved by the community. His name was Mr. DeMeo, and super liberal. Like, a lot of our parents didn't consent to sexual education, and he tore up those papers and said, I'm going to teach all of you about sex ed. I don't care what your parents say, and if they have a problem, like, they can come visit me. And this guy was, his hands were the size of my head. He was like the most macho guy you can imagine. No one's going to confront him about that. So, but because someone's so popular and charismatic like him, kind of himself, my last name triggered him, where my first day of school, I would, I immediately like saw this pretty person, and I was like, wow, like, look at that. I hope they notice me. And then he made sure everyone noticed me by bringing me up to the front of the board and telling and like personifying me as the Soviet Union, even though we fled the Soviet Union, and then telling his childhood story about having to hide from nuclear, attack because of me. And he would use my name.
Jesus.
And he would have the children go under the tables in this exercise, except me, and like kind of role play what he had to go through because of Raphael. And he would always talk about me through my last name only, like Shimunov. And that ended that prospect of that relationship, and everything became very tense there. So yeah, for me, seeing I'm not even Russian, but seeing a Russian seeing something change the culture and pick at it about and normalizing Russians actually was really powerful for me, even though we ran away from that.
Yeah, and what's fascinating about Worf being Russian on The Next Generation is it creates this continuity with the original series, where one of the big things was there's a Russian guy on the bridge, there's Chekhov, and then there was sort of like, don't quote me on this, but I swear I saw an interview with Gene Roddenberry somewhere talking about how putting a Klingon on the bridge in Next Generation was the same kind of move, where they wanted Worf to be visible as sort of like somebody who would be surprising internally within like sort of our knowledge of Star Trek, the way it would have been surprising in the 60s to see a Russian and a black woman on the bridge. And then making him Russian is that just sort of a continuity with that, where like, here we have a Russian on the bridge again, but he looks a little different.
Yeah. I mean, and I think by the time it's DS9 that's changed in some ways, and how much that they sent, like DS9 is so much about Worf being a Klingon and that part of his identity. How does Worf change DS9 when he arrives, and how does like the space station and social dynamics in the universe of the show, and does being on DS9 change Worf?
I know like a lot of my friends who are Orthodox or were Orthodox also find commonality with Worf, and I find that Worf's evolution is really tied to being this like straight-laced like rule follower, right? As you said in the beginning, really tense, and then I think evolving towards like to not be, right, to be kind of rebellious in almost every aspect, yet holding on to his values strongly, but really just claiming ground for himself. And he does it in a way that a lot of like Orthodox Jewish friends of mine have done it, where they use the skills, like they use the critical thinking, like critique skills and the analysis skills, and then they turn it on their own teachings and their own teachers. So there's still this basis, and just like watching him transform also reminds me of that. So I feel like Worf, it's almost like Bajorans, where it's such a apt, like it's such a flexible and universal kind of mode, right? That a Palestinian can see themselves there, and a Jew can see themselves there, and so many different people can place themselves and for different reasons in so many of these characters, that it's just mind-boggling how wonderful that is, and how this universe just is able to mutate in all of our psyches.
And I do think Worf has a very different place within the community on Deep Space Nine than he did on The Next Generation. Because on the Enterprise, like, he's a very good fit. It's all of these people that are like the kind of people who get to work on the flagship. Whereas in Deep Space Nine, he shows up and he's all Mr. Regulations, and everybody else is like, yeah, we're here, like, between a wormhole and Bajor, and like, sometimes the rules just get bent because none of that really works on a practical day-to-day basis. And a lot of the tension, and I would argue that it really is all the way through, that even though he adapts, he's still always the most rule-bound one there. That he comes in, and it's one of the things that's hard for him is that the rules really don't apply in the same way.
And it's so interesting to connect that back with his Klingon identity, because so much of the stories are about him being his role at Star Trek and his wanting and his viewing. He views himself as like the most Klingon, and the Klingons don't see him that way because he's in Starfleet, but he thinks himself as the embodiment of like he wants to be the most Klingon that you can possibly be. And that's, that's like so much of the conflict that he has here. But I also just think the way he shows up on the show, like his hair is nerdy on Star Trek, and his hair is much more relaxed and at peace with itself when he shows up in DS9. Like he's less awkward, even though he's an awkward fit. He as an individual is less awkward and a little bit more self-confident, I think, by the time he shows up, even though he says like, oh, I don't know what I'm here for. I don't know what I'm looking for yet. I'm like, he feels like he's grown nonetheless to me.
Yeah. I just thinking about it now, I remember how my dad identified with him as well. Like when DS9 started, we were a lot older, and, and my dad would actually told me the story while we were watching DS9. And it was, when Worf was introduced to DS9, I think Sisko's quote was something like, we need a Klingon to deal with Klingons.
Yes.
And,
yes.
Right. And that opened my dad up to the story where he told me the first time when he came to the U.S. to New York, the Reagan administration then had him go to this hotel. Like, they just told him, you must attend this hotel, go to this floor. The whole floor was just like State Department. Everyone spoke Russian. They weren't Russian, they were Americans. And everyone spoke Russian to him. And they basically produced in front of him, like, he was in the Air Force. So they produced in front of him like maps of their barracks and their landing pads and this and that, and then like tested him to see if he would lie to them, then try to get intelligence out of him, and all of these things. And he, like, just watching, we couldn't even pause Star Trek back then, and just watching it and constantly interrupting each other with how Worf relates to each of us is just like profound. And I really didn't think about it from my dad's lens until really right now.
That's wild. But I also think, like you mentioned, like some of the parental relationship between him and Alexander, which I know is so important to his character in DS9 and in TNG as well.
Yeah, there's this aspect I think I examine a lot, and that is this having come here without the enclave, having come here without the cultural scaffolding of all of that. I did feel like, and I still do, largely insecure about the culture, and I can't think of a more insecure way than depicted as when Worf really like tries to kind of raise a son and tries to kind of like, not just even his son, but like when he's stuck on X planet, I forget which episode this was, but he was on this planet of Klingon
alien
survivors.
Children. He like adopts a lot of kids and attempts to adopt a lot of kids. Yeah, and it never really comes through.
and he sometimes often like overcompensating because of that insecurity, but also really like a true believer and like really trying to push it ahead. And I feel like that's how we reacted a lot too, until, you know, more of us came. And then we were still outsiders. Like the way that people address Worf, the Klingons address Worf, is very similar to how, and it's also like, it actually helps a lot that our language is actually Bukhari that we speak actually sounds like Klingon. And I used to joke as a kid that my dad spoke Klingon, like, you know, and then people believed me because he would call me inside from outside in Bukharian, and it would sound like Klingon to people.
Give us at least one. Give us a line.
Oh, so like, so this is great. Bukharian young man who helps like translate. He's like one of the, like, there's no more really Bukharian speakers. There's very few. I think in '95 there was like less than 100,000, and now it's probably like a third of that in the world who can understand and speak the language. However, we all repeat certain things that are just like part of it, and so like, yeah, I do have a list of some examples. So like this guy Bobby Isakov, he's Bukharian young man, and he helps like translate these things. So I pulled this from a list that he created once for a group of Bukharians, and there's like, you know, there's like the very negative stuff you could say, but even when it's positive, like it just sounds really negative. So like there's one phrase that we always hear in our families, Kai Muram. And that basically, it's like, when am I going to die? Like, it's a very angsty, you know. Then there is Alvodat Gir Shavat, which means may your family perish and disappear, right? But like the really funny part, like, of, you know, like oh, there's the one with this means may your nose fall off. Abinet Zada Borod, right? And it's funny because I think like one of the preeminent insults in Klingon is patach, and you really look it up and it just means weirdo. You know what I mean? And this one just means may your nose fall off. But then even in the most positive ones, like the blessings, they sound like really angry Klingon. And I'm sorry, I apologize to fellow Boreans. And I do learn later a secret where it's actually more about the tribe I'm from and like how we speak versus Bukharians, because our language is actually Judeo-Persian Tajik dialect, which is actually very soft and beautiful. Like it's like poetry. But there's something about when my family says these words and I realize, oh, it's not Bukharians, it's probably my tribe. And when I ask like, so what is our tribe known for? Like no one would ever tell me until I got older. And my grandma told me, and she was just like, oh, we're known for eating meat, having lots of babies, and being loud, right? Like, I'm like, oh, great, you know. So it might happen to do more with like my family than anything. So like, here's some examples of like really like the blessings and how they sound and how my family would say them. One thing is like when you're offered food and you don't accept it, it's like a big insult, and they would say "Adase magir," and that means please take from my hand. It's like the kindest thing to say. There's one as farzana dokat bini, and that means may your children see good things. Like I could go on forever, and these phrases are just like, there's, you know, you could tell a lot in cultures of like what they're saying a lot because there's so many words for one. There's one phrase which is a blessing, but it's dark, that has like 70 words for it that you could use. And one of them is muramata. And basically it means, may I die instead of you. You know, like if the universe decides to take, or God decides to take you, may he reconsider and take me instead. And there's like 20 versions of that phrase, and they all sound Klingon. So there's just like so many levels in which this like sandwich that he became this like assembly of Bukharianisms for me.
I think that's fascinating too, because I've often heard that there's a lot of similarity between Klingon and Yiddish as well. And the linguist who created Klingon, this was like furious Googling in the background, Mark Okrand, is Jewish, is of Eastern European Jewish descent, and took a lot of the phonemes, the sounds, from what was familiar to him from hearing Yiddish as well. So there's something that's just sort of inherently, I think, Jewish about the way Klingon sounds and feels. And I think of things like, I know like 5 words in Klingon, but one of them is that the word for tribble is yech.
That is so good.
Which could not sound more Yiddish to me, but when you're using all those Bukharian phrases, I'm thinking, yeah, it has that feel to it too. And that there's just something about those sort of Jewish dialects that seems to be carried through in the way that Okrand constructed Klingon.
Absolutely. And then just join that with all of our military victory holidays. And you really drive it home.
It makes me think of how much I love the Klingons that we have who are not soldiers. Like the Klingon chef and the Klingon lawyer are like my 2 favorite other Klingons.
There's also like a Klingon. There's a couple of notable Klingon scientists on TNG, and there's one in particular that's a warp scientist, and there's something really charming about people who are still very Klingon but are like not warriors.
I mean, I one of the things I do love about DS9 is like you really do see that there are some wonderful things in Klingon culture. Meanwhile, I'm always screaming at my TV whenever the Cardassians do anything. It's like, Cardassians, your entire culture is trash. There is no redeeming qualities whatsoever. And like, I think that it's important. It's so important that Star Trek has like these good and endearing and like positive things with Klingon culture that we see in DS9. And, when we start to see the drama and the conflict between the Federation and the Klingon Empire, I was so upset because I was like, but it's so important for me that the Klingons and the Federation like not be enemies. Like this is that. I mean, in the end, I think the storyline was great. I have no complaints about it, but like it was hard for me to see that rupture, because that mattered a lot. So, one of the questions, Sarah, I hope you don't mind if I jump to this, because this is a question from your fiance.
Yes.
Is Worf a cultural fetishist when it comes to Klingon culture? Is this why he's such an outsider?
Like, is he trying to be more Klingon than Klingons because he didn't grow up within the culture in the same way that pretty much all other Klingons did?
I mean, that is a diaspora kind of constant, right? If you look across reality, like oftentimes that does occur. I don't know. I don't feel it. I feel like he really champions it in a genuine way. And it could be driven from insecurity, but what culture and religion really, that coexisted with war and things like that and famines and things isn't, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of what Amy perceives as cultural fetishism, I think kind of arises from just the intersection between Worf's personality and his desire to connect with Klingon culture. So he's by nature somebody who likes to have a lot of rules and structures to follow. So he goes and he finds all of the rules of Klingon culture and he follows them, and he finds that really comforting. Whereas you get somebody like Martok, who's a little looser and a little more fun, or certainly Dax, who is a fan of Klingon culture in a very different way, where they tend to bring out sort of the drinking and the parties and the joy, and those are all parts of the culture. And the fact that different people are able to find a connection to different parts of that very rich culture within sort of the Star Trek universe, I think points to how well the world building and the sort of anthropological sci-fi building goes when it comes to Klingons.
there was a whole thread that I cannot find years ago where someone was making the case that Worf was really Russian and not Klingon, and that like he's trying to be Klingon, but like it's projection of his idea of what it means to be Klingon, and it's not rooted in the reality of what Klingons are at that moment in history, and that so many of the things that he views as being Klingon are actually like Russian. And I cannot find that thread, and it blew my mind.
Yeah. I wonder though, like if that's us forcing kind of a lens on it because of, you know, how people talk about humans, and, you know, we're all like actually the same species, right? But in the case of like Star Trek, a lot of the characters are not. So like, you know, Worf does physically have a sense of smell that energizes him for the hunt and tracking and all of these things. And there are like aspects to him that are Klingon, and you can't argue them out really and say he's just Russian just because, you know what I mean? Like there's just so much that's built in, and it's not true with humans to humans, but it's definitely true across like the Star Trek universe.
Yeah,
I'll buy it.
I think that, yeah, and it's like on the first of all, like you can be more than one thing. He can be Russian and Klingon at the same time. And it's also, I'm thinking about like, and it's one of this is where I'd want to talk to somebody with this lived experience more directly, but thinking about the experiences of people living in North America, adopted by usually white parents who are adopted from East Asia or from Latin America, and where they are, you know, very clearly product of the culture they were raised in, but they look how they look. And the way they look does often differentiate them within their communities, no matter how much their cultural background is the same as all of their neighbors.
It sort of reminded me of my favorite listener question. No offense, but my favorite listener question that we got sent in from Elisa Shavinsky. She asked, she'd be interested in Worf's insights on Worf as a BT, which stands for Baal Teshuvah, meaning roughly, you know, someone who was very strict in their interpretation of Jewish law and eventually, you know, like changed that saying so. Raphael's insights on Worf as a BT, in so much as his relationship to Klingon culture, is arguably similar to the BTs to Orthodox culture. This was, yeah, I thought that was really interesting.
There is this
question,
like, identity piece that, for me, is like Mizrahi Jew, who's like Jews of Central Asia and North Africa, who like through the American lens and definitely through the Star Trek lens, Jews are very European and Ashkenazi, and a lot of the things that people attribute to Worf and his parents and you know, Leonard Nimoy and all these things are very European Jewish.
Yeah.
But in Worf's case in particular, to me, to our culture, he was actually closer to Jewish as a Klingon to us because, like for example, like prune juice, which is like a topic that's always, you know, haunting him. And I think from the Ashkenazi lens, it's like, okay, another Jew with IBS issues, you know, needs a little help. But from the Bukharian view, it juxtaposes nicely with like our very kind of extremely macho culture of like furry men who sit down and have tea from tiny little teacups and porcelain tea kettles together, yelling and arguing, but also like holding hands and kissing each other on the cheek, and really, you know, again speaking Klingon, and so to us, like a lot of the jokes about Jewish identity and the tropes of Jewish identity are kind of like, you know, more of like Curb Your Enthusiasm versus like, you know, it's like macho quote unquote guy and a woman at home doing, just, cooking and and having these like old traditional roles and this and that. So like even that was a culture clash when Bukharians went to Israel and here to New York, where I think there's this famous scene where, and she actually mistakens it, but like Fran meets like one of us, like a Mizrahi Jew, and of course it's always conflated with Sephardi too, and she goes, "Oh, what are you, Sephardi?" And it's like this exotic Jew, you know what I mean, like this other exotic Jew that has all this other different kind of traits that are I think complementary, right? So so there was this other thing at play for me where he was even more Jewish to me than Leonard than Spock.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely Ashkenormative, a word I've learned fairly recently, tendencies in how pop culture at large, displays like Jewish identity in media. And it's interesting also just because, like, I mean, I don't want to get completely sidetracked into a conversation about how Judaism is handled in the series, but except I guess I'm about to, like, I grew up unaware of some of the negative Jewish stereotypes. And so like somebody had to tell me at a certain point, like, that Jews are supposed to be greedy. I was like, I thought we were communists and anti-American. I didn't know we were greedy. And so then having people be like, oh, like, well, look, the Ferengi are an anti-Jewish stereotype, and me being like, I was unaware of this. I didn't know that people thought that about us because I thought we were all communists and like worked in the entertainment industry. I had positive stereotypes as I saw them rather than negative stereotypes as I would interpret them. But yet all of that is very Ashkenormative in how it's portrayed on the show. And yeah, like Leonard Nimoy, like, or Eastern European Jews. That's like, what's up? I think like, I think one of her questions though is like, is he going through a journey of being more Orthodox when he starts and then becoming more integrated and like less strict to the letter of the text over the course of the show? And certainly in the wedding episodes, which I freaking love, you do see him having to, like, the struggle of like being more flexible or more rigid in the celebration of the wedding. I mean, one thing I do love is that Worf is like the wedding princess, where like he's like, my wedding, I have been dreaming about it my whole life, and it has to be like this, this, and this. And I love Dax is like, yeah, I've had a lot of weddings, so I'm going to let him be the wedding princess. And I'm like, thank you, because let's not gender this. Like, you don't have to be a girl to be the wedding princess, right? I shouldn't even be gendering it like that, but like folks know what I mean when I say that.
He's the groomzilla.
He's the groomzilla, yes. But his groomzilla-ing is about fidelity to Klingon tradition. Yeah. And I love the wedding, but I also I find like the wedding ceremony itself like meaningful. Like the two Klingon hearts that are so powerful together they can't even be stopped by God. I'm like, this is like, somebody could like totally legitimately do that at their wedding ceremony, and I would be 100% there for it. And even if you didn't tell me it was from Star Trek, and then beating people up who've made you fast for a while, I think is also.
Are you trying to tell me that like we should go call our officiant and say, hey, we didn't say we were going to have a Klingon wedding, but maybe.
But it's too late.
It's not too late.
We are now. Right, that's true. It's not too late.
It's not too late. We have 3 months to mess with our wedding. Anyway. I feel like one of the difficulties with Deep Space Nine's depiction of Worf is that there is less character continuity for him than there is for some of the other characters. And so he'll seem very open and very culturally relative and very like, this is how my Klingon identity fits into my larger sense of, Starfleet and all that. And then the next episode, he'll be like, very, like participating in a terrorist action to destroy a vacation planet because people are being slutty.
I know. Oh my God.
We all pretend the episode doesn't exist, but it exists.
It doesn't.
That, like, I think it's hard to answer that question because I don't think there's a linear movement for him from being very rule bound and traditional toward being, liberated and relativist. And I feel like, honestly, that's more realistic in a lot of ways, that you'll see somebody and you'll feel like, well, this person is seeing their relationship with their culture, their religion in a much more relativist way. And then the next week they say something and you're like, people don't change overnight. It's not a wholesale movement, and maybe it shouldn't be. And maybe we just accept that, like, Worf has that in him, and it's always going to be a tension within him rather than something where he moves from point A to point B.
That's also believable for how people are too, right?
That's my point, is, and maybe we shouldn't be, like, saying, well, we need this character arc where Worf starts out like a very rule-bound traditionalist Klingon, and his arc is toward liberation from that. Maybe, like, and this is very consistent with, I think, Deep Space Nine overall, what we want is to just let Worf be Worf. If that's what makes Worf happy, like, the only time it's a problem is when it's hurting somebody, like it did in the Ryza episode where it was hurting Dax. Like, if that rule following is what gives him comfort and gives him meaning, like, that's great. That's part of diversity. That's part of why we like him.
Speaking of why we like Worf gets the hot chicks.
All of them.
I mean,
Every series.
As much as he's into being Klingon, he has diverse taste in women, not just Klingon women. Even though he does get Cyrano de Bergerac to, like, get with Dax. I guess this leads me to an important Twitter question we received, which was, does Worf fuck? Was the question. And I'm like, how dare you ask me that? Obviously, I took it very literally. I'm like, Worf obviously fucks because we see that in episodes. But there's the internet meme. So I guess the question would be, like, let's think of reflecting on Worf's omnivorous taste in women, and also to what extent does Worf fuck?
Oh, he's definitely, the word is out. Like, he's down.
I mean, look at his track record. he gets Kalar, he gets Deanna Troi, he gets Jadzia Dax. Mirror Worf has to turn Mirror Garrick down, which, that itself takes some courage. Like, Worf fucks, and again,
Ezri,
that's one of the delightful things about his character, is, like, he gets the women.
I liked the whole plot with him and Ezri. I liked that they had hooked up and got it out of their systems and were done with it. Like, that made me happy.
Yes, one of the many moments of Deep Space Nine having a mature and nuanced attitude toward, like, different kinds of emotional and sexual relationships that people can have. The sort of, like, a relationship doesn't have to, like, last forever to be successful. That was a very successful processing of that emotional and sexual relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it only takes one person to accumulate, 5 lifetimes to be able to help pull it off.
That's a good point. Yeah, I know. I do think it's interesting that, like, he requires getting Cyrano'd to, like, really take Dax seriously as a potential, when, like, literally every single person in the entire space station other than him would be like, is Dax even slightly looking at me? Yes, my life has meaning.
It was kind of uncomfortable how much it was just like every other episode was like the the male gaze, like for Dax everywhere, like by so many characters. I don't think it would fly these days. It was just like too much.
No,
it didn't really
we definitely
fly
talked about
then.
that.
It was, I remember watching it and being like, really?
And listeners, listen to episode 3 where Sarah and I talk about the particularly 90s nature of feminism as conveyed on DS9. But like, I think, but you know, Worf coming and like giving, like Worf's coming to the series was really great for Dax's character because, you know, as Terry Farrell says, like it gave her the space to become quote unquote action Barbie. Like she got to become, they got to really delve into her knowledge of the Klingon culture, her Klingon fandom, and her like martial arts interests, which we wouldn't have really have had as much of a reason to get into through then. I mean, and Worf really does, like, we know he was added to DS9 for the purposes of like bringing some more attention to the series, but he does really invite with him some awesome Klingon plots. Like, who doesn't love, you know, Martok and Galron, and all of them are such a blast. I think the one Klingon-y plot that he really has that I feel like is really divisive is his son. I think his relationship with Alexander and Alexander existing on the show and all of that is like really divisive between the fans.
Yeah, I think there is this like recurring thing. He's just not really overall there as like a dad, right? Through the story, but a lot of them aren't.
No, there's like recurring memes about how Worf is the worst father on Star Trek. So there are some fraught and troubled parent-child relationships, but like Worf is usually singled out as being like, I will just send you away to live with your grandparents because I can't deal with you.
But I love that when his son shows up, he's like, fuck, you know, he was being being a disappointment to me for being inadequately Klingon. And I was like, well, that's okay. You're just going to be regarded as a human and you can go do human things with your human grandparents. And then he's like, oh, now that my son actually wants to be part of active Klingon culture, he's doing it badly and he's shaming me. Like there's no pleasing Worf. And it's like, well, you didn't raise him. So, you know, how did you think this was going to go?
He's also got this like traumatized little kid who just sort of throws him into school and he doesn't know what to do with him and has no support, which is too bad. Again, like you'd think by the 24th century they would have individually tailored child supportive, you know, trauma-informed structures to help, you know, this really confused little kid who's dealing with the loss of his mother. But apparently, like, they do not.
I understand the show not wanting to saddle him with having to have a young child on the show. But, like, when he comes back and he's a teenager, I mean, like, there was too much for the show to do to really do more with Alexander. But like, if the show had endless seasons, I would not have minded seeing that get expanded on, I guess is what I would say. Like, I know why they didn't expand on it, but I think that there's a rich story that there could be with that.
Well, he is a young child on Next Generation. He's like 6.
Right.
Like he's a little
But he's
kid.
not like there that much. Yeah.
He's there. Right? He's there enough.
Mm.
He's there. I think he makes like 6 or 7 appearances. He gets to sit in a mud bath with Waxana Troy.
I mean, hashtag goals, but you know, whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
That's got to be awkward for a child. My brain is just like, I don't know how to process this information.
Nobody has been able to process that episode. That's one of the don't watch this one sober kind of episodes of Next Generation. But there's a lot of time jumping in how they depict Alexander, where he's a little kid on Next Generation and then you don't see him again until Deep Space Nine, and he's aged a good 10 years from when you last saw him in what in real time would have been much less than that if they'd aged him the way they aged like Molly O'Brien. When you saw him on Deep Space Nine, he would have been maybe like 12 at most.
Any other thoughts on Worf's relationship with his son, Raf? Or we can move on.
I always wonder, like, sometimes if I ascribe too much to like the story versus like, hey, he didn't do well on the rating, so they kind of like toned him down after a while. Like how much of my analysis of things are really about like the commercial aspects of behind the scenes.
I mean, yeah, I definitely like the commercial like is why, Worf ends up on DS9, but like it really did so much good stuff for the show and for Worf. And not just the new hairstyle, but it did help. Although I guess I should say, like, one of us is a Jew of color. None of us are black. I do think that, like, it's interesting. So, we don't really see Michael Dorn addressed as being a black person until he's present in Somewhere Beyond the Stars, which is, that alternate episode where Sisko is writing science fiction in the 20th century.
Yeah, and then we see Michael Dorn without the makeup, and he's visible as a black actor in a way that I think a lot of people who watched the shows might not have even realized that Michael Dorn was black until he appeared out of makeup in that episode. If they didn't, read magazines or, go to conventions, they might not have known that.
Yeah, since they're doing so much brown face on the other Klingons, like, it's so awful. Why? So I'm really glad. I mean, that episode, I'm really glad it exists for all kinds of reasons, including the fact that it's fucking amazing. But I actually do also think it's particularly important that they had a moment where you're like, Michael Dorn is black, like, and that informs, I think, or should inform at least some people's like understanding of the performance, I think, and the character. I mean, because there's a question like, what does it say if like you're saying that Klingons are like, oh, they're savage and we're going to have a black actor play a Klingon? And it's like, yeah, but the Klingons, they're not just savage. Like, and there are all kinds of different people playing Klingon actors. And Worf is like the most sort of staid and dignified. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I can see somebody going and trying to make a case that's fucked up, but I'm like, I don't think the text upholds that. The problem is the brown face. That's the problem.
There's that Cold War parallel too, where during the tipping point of the Cold War, Russians were depicted as this like one-dimensional, warlike people, and and later as the Cold War kind of warmed up, the other dimensions were added, like even in like Rocky by then, there was like other three-dimensionality added to it. And I feel like that also happened with Klingons. And then there was that war, and it just like was very familiar looking in the timing of that.
I feel like there's always been kind of a tense relationship between Star Trek doing as much as it can to cast diversity, not always succeeding. But I remember when Tim Russ was announced as playing Tuvok on Voyager, one of my like friends in high school went into this long rant about how like Vulcan biology made it impossible to have black Vulcans, and I'm just like sitting there on the school bus being like, do you hear yourself? So I think that as much as it is frustrating that Michael Dorn isn't really visible as a black actor in the way that we might like him to be, just the fact that Star Trek was willing to say, there's visible diversity among aliens, and we're never gonna, say that such and such an alien race must be cast with actors of one background or another. Like, there's limitations to that approach, and there's, the brown face problem that gets built into that and things like that. But at the same time, like, one of the really radical things about the casting of Next Generation was, in addition to having a very visible black actor in LeVar Burton, just sort of saying, Michael Dorn is this character. We're putting him in this role.
Also, weird side note, but like amazing side note. There's a group called the Vulcan Society in New York City, which is like a fraternal organization of black firefighters. And I only know really because they really rose to prominence in recent years because they sued the FDNY for just openly excluding black firefighters and making sure, only their family, their like Irish and Italian families kind of made it through the process. And they actually are called the Vulcan Society. And I just thought it was just like, when you said Vulcans can't be black because of XYZ, your friend said that, immediately I just thought of this weird New York City fact that I just had to share.
Which is funny also because like it's Vulcan because of the fire. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's really cool. And I think it's sort of look at, two sides of the same issue of like, of representation just being important from any angle, even if, and, saying, well, if it's imperfect representation from the past, it's a way to talk about how to do it better now, not something that we should dismiss because it was imperfect at the time.
At the time, yeah. I love that, like the final, at the end of the series, the top Cardassian you see is played by a black actor. Like after Damar has switched sides, like the guy who's left standing. I'm like, see, thank you. You cast a black actor as like a random alien species and put him in random face paint, So one of the things that really stuck with me is at the very end of DS9, the end of the series shows it's not like a happily ever after ending. It's, it gives people lots of different potential plots and storylines for the future. And in the end of it, we see Worf become a Federation ambassador to the Klingon Empire. Raf, what do you think of that as a role for Worf? Is that a good place for him to be? Will he like that? Will he succeed?
It was so boring. It's like when my activist friends become executive directors. I'm just like, no, come back, no.
Yeah, I shared your disappointment. I was like, I don't think he's going to like that at all. I think he's not going to like that.
Yeah, it made me sad that he was never going to make captain.
Yeah,
that
he would
too.
have been an awesome
Good point.
captain.
Well, I mean, even Sisko says so, right? When disciplining him for like in the Unfrozen Klingon Lawyer episode, he still said, "You're going to make one hell of a captain someday."
Which is the name of that episode. It's possibly my favorite Worf episode on Deep Space Nine. And
didn't you do something there where Sisko then said that you could probably never be captain after that? I forget what it was.
Yeah, except that
maybe
he didn't do it. Like, it turned out that it was a Klingon frame job.
Right. Oh, you mean in that episode he said that. Okay.
Right.
Yeah, I like what do you think would be a happier ending for Worf at the end of DS9?
He gets promoted to full commander and gets, you know what? Honestly, Sisko's gone. Put him in charge of Deep Space Nine.
Wow.
Yeah. I would like to subscribe to your newsletter.
I believe you do subscribe to my newsletter. It's called my 2 a.m. texts.
Oh yeah, that's true.
I mean, if there was another way, like a device to kind of poetically, I know Worf kind of cobbled back together like his prestige among other Klingons, but if there was a way for him to have like that final, like being the ultimate Klingon to Klingon normies at some point, that would have been interesting to me. But maybe it's cooler this way. But definitely seeing him as a commander of the station or a ship would have been amazing.
Yeah, like he's so... Starfleet suits him in a really fundamental way, and I think that that's one of the things that the character continually comes back to, that as much as he loves being a Klingon, he's very deliberately made the choice to be in Starfleet, and he loves being in Starfleet, and he's proud. So taking that away
Sarah,
from him
do you
seems
want to
kind of
ask?
awful. What, sorry?
Yeah. Especially to go and like serve in a place that doesn't really appreciate him enough, in my opinion. Although Martok does, but I love Martok.
But
And also,
Martok
he's
is
not
his own
exactly
thing.
Mr. Persuasion. Like, it's not like as an ambassador,
yeah.
like he's in the behind the scenes, like being persuasive or anything. It's just like that's not in his skill set.
Yeah.
He's a strategic
That is not
like
his strongest
thinker.
suit.
He's a tactician. He's like a romantic and all. And even like I would say he's one of the most poetic people in the thing. I could never see him like
Yes.
kissing ass and doing the things that an ambassador does.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
really good point.
He's just not cut out for it.
Who wants to be?
I mean, I would love, like, I feel like being like, if Ilana existed in Star Trek land, I would be like really interested in being an ambassador, but that's not Worf. We are very different, Worf and I. So, I mean, do you have any favorite Worf story arcs in general?
I think like we touched on it mostly with the parent arc, but to me, his constant challenge of being excluded and then re-included into the fringes of Klingon society and different houses, and just like how it was just really powerful how it kind of showed how transactional it could be and how your status could change in like overnight, and very much like, again, I don't want to make it, I know it's Rosh Hashanah and today is actually Star Trek Day and all these two things together, but and the issue is like Worf as a Jew of color, but generally speaking, like it does remind me too of like the temporary basis of like Jewish privilege, especially to Jews of color, where depending on your last action, you're immediately decided if you're Jewish or not, or you're immediately questioned if you're Jewish or not, unlike anyone other Jews. Like Noam Chomsky is never questioned for being Jewish or not, but if a Jew of color espouses anything, let's say similar to Noam Chomsky, they're immediately put into question their Judaism. So that to me, as a Jew of color, I experience and I see another parallel there for him, and how fleeting his identity is depending on the world around him.
Yeah.
For those who don't spend too much time online and who are white, like the extent to which like right-wing white Jews spend their time on Twitter, like harassing Jews of color and claiming that they're not really Jewish is astonishing. Like, I swear one of the biggest projects of right-wing white Jews in America is to claim that Jews of color are lying and not really Jewish. It's like sociopathy. There's like literal Twitter accounts that just exist to say this to people.
Yep. Yeah, they'll do the whole background. They'll dox you. I've had like my family tree posted and like put into question. My friends have. It's pretty wild. And then there is also in the center space as well, like there's a blind spot there, with in particular with Black Jews and the friction between white Jewish society and Black Jews in the fold, because like right now we're talking about Jewish safety with white supremacists, like trying to hurt Jews in synagogues and other places. And then, the reaction of like, oh, more cops, more guns, more police, more prosecutions, more hate crime laws. And like without much, and when Black Jews are speaking up even offline about how that puts them in more danger, again, suddenly the question of their Jewishness comes up again.
Yeah. That brings me to one of the last questions we had, which is that there's a really powerful parallel between Worf's experience and Odo's experience, partially because they have kind of similar personalities in a way that's fun and they become friends, but partially just because they have in common that they're both like the lone representative of a species that is seen as the bad guy, as the enemy, whereas culturally they're sort of between that, and Odo probably much more thoroughly than Worf, like, was raised on Bajor. Like, this is for the Odo episode, but like, presumably when the Universal Translator isn't working, Odo speaks Bajoran. Like, but there's a similarity there with there's that tension between how they look and who they are. And like the erasure of whether they count as who they are.
Yeah. And also like how transactional it is, how like when who they are is useful, how it's leaned into, and then when it's challenging, how it's diminished. It's just very, very powerful. But also it just touches on like this, my favorite thing about Star Trek writ large, and DS9 in particular too, is this like notion of like, what I love about this podcast is like it overlays, graphic policy kind of overlays the like our social movements, our organizing with these stories and this set of mythology, and in doing so really shows what I think is kind of essential for our survival. And like, for example, we frame it as multiracial, multicultural, multi-generational, like coalition, right? That we need like this kind of radical solidarity in order to survive. The kind of oppression and economic, racial, all of it. And the way I've come to look at it is like, we are all like in a lot of our friend circles, we are Worf and we are Odo and we are Kira, and we're our societies are organized in these kind of long tables that form a circle. And at the very far end of each of these long tables is like, my friend who lives in the village, but his parents are in Iowa, and they're Trumpers, and they're on that long side of that table, but their son is at this other smaller edge circle and with me. And then on my table on the far edge, there's like Trumper Bukharians. And so like we're all like connected this way. And it's not just ethnic, it's also like gender and all sorts of different identities. And we're in this kind of like circle that's very much like the Federation, that's very much like DS9. And like my favorite thing both about all of these things and this podcast is really like it celebrates that aspect, which I think more and more as we see with white supremacy and to the Texas laws and misogyny and all those things, that this little circle we have is really the antidote, and without it I don't think we survive.
Thank you. That's like really powerful. And thank you for the praise as well.
Yeah, it's a very end of the podcast here. What, anybody got anything they want to plug? Let's wrap it up. Kind of like, like it's such a beautiful statement about what Star Trek does and what Star Trek means, that concept of like the long table and the small circle, and expanding our sense of who's at our table by who we see in the media and which characters and which cultures and which experiences resonate with us.
So ironically it means we're all ambassadors.
I mean, we are.
Hooray. So Raf, where can our listeners keep up with your amazing work on the
Well, mostly it's not amazing, but it'll entertain you. Twitter, Rafael Shimunov.
So that's RafaelShimunov. And as for me, I am on Twitter a little bit too much at ELANA_Brooklyn. Always with graphic policy, interviewing comics writers, artists, creators. And I want to urge folks to like and review the podcast on whatever platform you listen to it. It really does help people find the show. And Sarah?
I'm Sarah Daniel Rasher. I am on Twitter, not nearly enough by Alana's standards, at Padishah, PAS_DECHAT. That is also who I am on Letterboxd. I put my writing, whether it be about the sport of figure skating or the movies I'm watching, or I've got a thing about Batman coming up, as well as some actual writing about figure skating because the season started. All of that is at thefinersports.com.
Awesome. And I guess I'm going to have some other horror movie podcasts on Progressively Horrified, the podcast where we hold horror to standards it absolutely did not agree to. And I think that's it from us. Oh, one thing I know, I don't know if our next episode is going to be about Gul Dukat, but we are doing an episode about Gul Dukat soon. So if you have questions or things you want us to talk about Gul Dukat, feel free to email them to us or send them to us at deepspacedive@gmail.com.
There's an upcoming Gul Dukat and an upcoming Morn.
Oh, right. And yes, we have an upcoming Morn episode. So yeah, I know we're like, we haven't done like an episode about Cisco yet, but we've got Gul Dukat and we've got more. That's partially because I have a friend who I really want to have on to do Cisco and he needs to like get ready for it. But yeah, we've got Gul Dukat and Morn coming up. So send us your questions.
So thank you for listening. And as Odo says, if you can take a mud bath with Luoxana Troy, take that mud bath.
Hey, thanks for watching the previous video from Graphic Policy Television. Just by watching, you help support our site. Thank you so much. Now, if you're watching these videos, you probably care about geeky things like movies, television, comic books, toys, games, video games, you name it. You can go and subscribe right now to our YouTube channel to stay in touch and catch all the new videos, or check out our website at graphicpolicy.com. There's a nice link on this end of the video. But as always, thank you for watching. Keep on rocking and keep it geeky.